By the time Margaret Ericsson reached the turnpike stone, the rain had already found her through the seams of her boots, and each step sent cold water between her toes, as if the road itself wished to remind her what she was worth. The hamper bit into the crook of her arm. The linen around her right hand had gone pink at the knuckle where the skin had split on a needle the previous night. Yet she held the basket level so the lace inside would not drag against the damp. Dawn had not broken. The hedges were black lines against a lower black sky. She walked the 3 miles from Halwick Court to the market because Lady Voss would not pay for a cart and would not permit the housemaid to carry goods she called delicate, though she had called Margaret clumsy often enough for the word to stain. In the first square she passed, a milk wagon stood angled in the mud, while 2 boys unloaded pails with red hands and hard breathing. They glanced at her once, then away, then back again, with the flat curiosity reserved for women who belonged nowhere obvious. Her mantle was too thin for November and too old to hold shape, patched at one shoulder with thread 1 shade lighter than the wool. Her skirts were hemmed short from earlier wear and clung dark at the edge. A groom from a neighbouring house came fast behind with Lady Voss's maid beside him, both dry under an oilskin. The butcher's apprentices moved at once to clear a path for them. For Margaret they moved after a pause when she was already stepping sideways around a crate of turnips and nearly slipping. No one apologised. No one was required to. She crossed the market square while bells sounded the half-hour from St. Jude's. Smoke from morning fires lay low under the rain. The public pump stood near the stone trough where carters watered teams, and there she set down the hamper on the least filthy patch she could find. Her fingers had stiffened so badly she could not close them fully. The split knuckle throbbed in pulses. A private clock under wet cloth. She unwound the linen with her teeth, rewound it tighter, and began her work. Borrowed lace from Lady Voss's newest sleeves had taken a thin streak of blood where Margaret's hand had failed in the attic last night. Lady Voss had called it sabotage. Margaret had called it nothing at all. She pumped water with her left hand, scrubbed with her right, and held the pale fabric against the iron lip until her wrists trembled. Men came and went with baskets and knives and chalked ledgers. They saw a dark-haired girl bent over cloth in the cold. They did not see a daughter of the house that had once stood behind her name. By the time the lace ran clear, her jaw ached from clenching against chatter in her teeth. Hunger twisted low and sharp. She had taken half a crust from yesterday's kitchen board and hidden it in her sleeve before light, pressing it flat so it would not show. She did not eat it yet. If she ate now, she would have nothing when the return walk made her legs shake. She flexed her right hand once, and pain flashed up to her elbow. The skin beside her nails was rough and cracked from lye and cold water and cheap soap that stung like nettles. Her face in the pump's sheen looked thinner than it had in summer, cheeks hollowed, mouth set in that quiet line people called sullen when they wished to punish silence. Her eyes looked too large in the pale oval of her face. Watchful eyes, her father had once said, as if watchfulness were not a burden but a craft. Captain Ericsson had spoken that way about stars and storms and knots, as though every hard thing could be learned if one stayed steady long enough. She had been steady through the years after his death because there had been nothing else to do. Timber contracts had soured when ships were delayed. Creditors had come polite at first and less polite after. Her mother had remarried Lord Voss in the first winter of widowhood, and for a brief season Margaret had believed rescue and love might share one roof. Then fever took her mother before the second anniversary, and Lady Voss, who had married for title and security, found herself with a husband who drank and a stepdaughter who looked too much like the first wife's youth. Lord Voss died in his library with debts on every shelf. Lady Voss remained, fragrant with lavender water and silk that whispered before she spoke. She kept the drawing-room bright and the accounts dark. She sold Margaret's school books for card losses and called it simplification. She dismissed paid help and called it efficiency. She withheld supper and called it discipline. In company she named Margaret an obligation, as if reading from a household inventory, no more personal than coal. The square filled as morning advanced. By the second week of November the wind carried winter from the east and cut through wool as if it were gauze. Margaret repacked the cleaned lace in dry paper, lifted the hamper, and turned toward Halewick Court with mud sucking at her soles. She was 22 and had learned the measured pace that preserved strength over distance. A carter passing her looked once at the linen on her hand, then at her face, and then deliberately past her, the way men looked past furniture. She preferred that to pity. Pity loosened tongues. Tongues carried stories uphill to kitchens and down again to drawing-rooms, where ladies laughed into porcelain cups and asked whether the Erikson girl still imagined herself gentle-born. The answer was always given for her. She imagined nothing. She did what she was told. Halewick's service yard stank of wet straw and old ashes when she returned. Cook's boy took the hamper without thanks, because thanks belonged to exchanges between equals. Inside, heat struck her skin and made the pain in her fingers sharpen. She climbed the back stair to the attic room that had once stored linens and now stored her. The slope of the roof stole standing height near the far wall. Frost had etched the inside of the small pane in fern patterns, so delicate she hated them on sight. She wrung water from her hem into a basin, changed to a dry petticoat mended 4 times at the waist, and sat on the narrow truckle bed long enough to eat half the hidden crust in 3 slow bites. The crumbs stuck in her throat. She drank from the jug and felt the water sit heavy in an empty stomach. Then she rose because there were fires to lay, shoes to brush, silver to rub, and an afternoon of fitting Lady Voss's altered gowns by window light that failed early. No one in the main rooms addressed her by name unless displeased. She was girl or you there, or sometimes Erikson, when Lady Voss wished to remind guests that blood and rank could diverge so neatly. Margaret moved through doors that opened for others and closed before her shoulder reached them. Her stillness made people careless. They spoke in front of her. They forgot she listened. They forgot she could read figures as quickly as letters. They forgot Captain Erikson had taught her accounts beside navigation, saying a person lost at sea and a person lost in debt both needed bearings. In the pantry at dusk she counted cracked plates by touch in the dark and felt the linen on her knuckle dampen again. She bound it fresh. In the corridor mirror, briefly, she saw what the house described as plain, dark hair pinned without ornament, pale skin, narrow body in work dress. The mirror betrayed them. Endurance lit her face from within, severe and quiet, a kind of beauty no one could wear for an evening and set aside. Lady Voss summoned her after dinner. The drawing-room smelled of rose-water and coal polish. Candlelight struck the black jet at Lady Voss's throat and made it gleam like cold beads of rain. Her 2 daughters sat nearby with embroidery they barely touched, pretty in peach silk, expressions sharpened by boredom. On the side table lay a folded paper sealed in green wax. Margaret recognised Mr. Bream's hand from earlier bills, heavy loops pressing through both sides of cheap parchment. Lady Voss did not invite her to sit. "You will answer me plainly," Lady Voss said, each word smooth as polished glass. "Mr. Bream has made a practical offer. He is willing to overlook your deficiencies. You will accept within the week." Margaret kept her hands clasped, behind her back so the bandage would not show. "My lady, I do not wish to marry Mr. Bream." Lady Voss's mouth thinned. One daughter gave a small laugh, quickly hidden behind her needlework. Rain rattled against the pane, then steadied. "Wish is not a coin anyone spends on you," Lady Voss said. "1 week to accept Mr. Bream's proposal, or leave my house with nothing." Margaret lowered her eyes, because defiance in that room had a cost measured in meals, in sleep, in blows delivered where sleeves could hide marks. Her throat burned once, then it cooled into iron. "As you command, my lady," she said, and tasted blood where her split knuckle had opened again against her palm. Lady Voss let the silence hold until the rain became the loudest thing in the room, then lifted the green sealed paper and tapped it once against her palm as if she were correcting a child in church. "You mistake your position," she said. "Mr. Bream has mills, 2 houses, and no patience for sentiment. You have no dowry at hand, no prospects, and no guardian inclined to indulge stubbornness. This offer is generosity." Margaret kept her head bowed because that posture cost less than speech, but she looked without appearing to look, and saw, as she always saw, the careful theft that furnished the room around them. Her mother's carved rosewood work table now stood beneath Lady Voss's porcelain spaniels. The ormolu clock her father had brought from Copenhagen marked the 1/4 hour for women who had laughed when his coffin was carried through rain. Even the Kashmiri shawl folded over the eldest stepdaughter's lap had once been locked in Margaret's mother's cedar chest with camphor and clove. Her stepsisters, Clara and Estelle, wore her past as ornament. Clara's eardrops were small pearls set in gold leaves, a gift Captain Erikson had purchased in Portsmouth on the voyage before his last. Estelle's fingers toyed with a coral-handled fan that had belonged to Margaret at 14, when she had still believed there would be assemblies and music and a season in Bath if she read hard enough and stood straight enough and made no one ashamed. Lady Voss followed her gaze and smiled without warmth. "Do not stare at my daughters." My daughters. The phrase fell with the weight of years. Margaret had heard it first in the winter after her mother's death, when fever candles had burned low and the black crape was not yet packed away. When Lady Voss had stood in the nursery doorway and told the nursemaid in front of all 3 girls that Clara and Estelle were not to share ribbons, books, or tutors with the captain's solemn child from the first marriage. The tutors left soon after, dismissed for economy. The dancing master never returned. Margaret's French grammar and atlas vanished from the schoolroom shelf and appeared months later at a bookseller's stall in town, with her name scratched from the flyleaf. She had recognised the knife marks. She had walked past because she had 2 pennies and needed soap. 1 week, Lady Voss repeated now, each syllable bright and clean. "If you force me to put you out, you will go without reference, without money, and without claim." Margaret knew what lay under that threat. After Lord Voss died and creditors pressed, Lady Voss had produced papers no one had seen before, papers assigning management of Margaret's small inheritance to trustees until marriage, papers that turned a daughter's right into a purse held above her head like bait. Margaret had asked once to read the terms. Lady Voss had struck the request from the air with a laugh. "You will read what I permit." In the same week, the silver tea service had been sent away in a covered cart at dusk, the good horses sold, 3 maids dismissed, and Margaret moved from her old chamber on the 2nd floor to the attic under the north eaves where frost gathered on the inside of the pane. Debt had done part of that work. Spite had done the rest. "Answer me again," Lady Voss said. "Will you accept?" Margaret heard her own voice from a distance, steady as if spoken by another woman. "I have answered, my lady." Estelle's needle flashed. Clara gave that soft breath of laughter again. Lady Voss rose in a rustle of silk and came close enough for lavender and starch to sting Margaret's throat. "Then learn speed. Men do not wait for women in your condition." She turned away before dismissal was spoken, because dismissal was implied when one was not fully a person. Margaret inclined her head and backed from the room, her split knuckle throbbing against her palm, carrying with her the same old arithmetic she had carried since she was 16. How much bread remained? How many candles could be spared? How long a body could work on half portions? How quickly a name could be traded when money ran thin? The corridor beyond the drawing-room was colder than the rooms where guests sat, and the candles there guttered in their sconces, because tallow had been watered to save expense, a servant's trick every servant recognised, and no mistress acknowledged. Margaret passed the portrait gallery with her eyes on the runner, but memory rose in spite of discipline, fastening itself to each frame and panel and stair-tread, as if the house itself insisted on testimony. Her father's portrait had hung between Lord Voss's hunting scene and a landscape of Italian ruins until the year after the funeral, then vanished to the lumber room under pretext of rehanging. In its place stood a mirror that flattered candlelight and erased history. Captain Ericsson had been painted in navy coat and brass buttons, one hand on a chart table, his mouth stern by habit and kind by surprise. He had smelled of salt and pipe tobacco and clean wool. On winter evenings he had spread navigation notes across the library desk and shown Margaret how to find latitude from noon height, how to keep columns true, how to distrust any account that arrived too neatly balanced. "Storms leave marks," he had told her once, tapping a ledger margin where ink had blotted. "So do liars." Those words had become her private catechism after his ship failed to return. First there had been waiting, then there had been rumour, then the Admiralty letter with its careful phrases and no body to bury. Credit tightened around Halwick slowly, and then all at once. Timber buyers delayed payment. Agents spoke of losses in polite circles. Her mother, grey with grief and frightened by figures she did not understand, married Lord Voss in a ceremony held so quickly the morning crepe had barely dried. Margaret had stood at the back of the church in plain black and watched strangers call it prudent. For a handful of months it had looked almost bearable. Lord Voss had weak lungs, a weaker will, and a habit of borrowing against tomorrow, yet he had not been cruel. He had said little to Margaret beyond weather and books, but he had not forbidden either. Then fever took her mother in 6 days. Margaret remembered the basin water gone pink from sponged lips, remembered pressing cool cloths to a burning forehead, while Lady Voss, newly installed and already perfumed, directed drapers in the hall about where to place imported chairs. After the burial, house rules changed one by one until they formed a cage. Margaret's allowance ceased. Her room key was taken for inventory. Meals moved later and thinner, and if she arrived after the others, she found only broth, skin, and crumbs. Clara and Estelle inherited not only gowns and jewels, but permission. Permission to mock, to command, to summon her as if ringing for coal. They took her mother's lace fichus and cut them for doll dresses. They took her writing desk and filled it with theatre bills. They took the silver-backed hairbrush set, monogram and all, and laughed when Margaret hesitated in the doorway, because seeing one's initials in another girl's hand could still cut after all these years. In the library, the shelves thinned as debts thickened. Volumes disappeared by cartload, sold discreetly, then less discreetly, until only law digests Lord Voss never read, and account books nobody let her touch, remained under lock. At 17 she had asked Lady Voss for leave to seek paid post as governess and repay household costs. Lady Voss had answered with a slap that rang her ear and said, "You will not parade our difficulties to strangers." At 19, she had found mould in the bread bin and thrown the worst loaves out. Lady Voss docked 3 suppers for waste. At 21, she had stitched 14 shirts through one night for Clara's trousseau, and watched Clara claim in company that French seam work came naturally to ladies. Every humiliation had a practical face. Every practical decision had her name beneath it, in invisible ink. By the time she reached the back stair now, the storm outside had deepened, and from the kitchen came the smell of onion and dripping that would not include her unless cook took pity. She paused only long enough to wash the blood from her hand at the scullery pump, then carried fresh coal to the morning room, because the house was never so cold as when she was most tired, and fatigue did not excuse delay. When, at last, she climbed to the attic with a stub of candle and the day's wet hem dragging against her ankles, the bells from St. Jude's had already struck 9, and the strikes seemed to settle into her bones with the same hard inevitability as Lady Voss's ultimatum. The room under the eaves held its familiar inventory of want: truckle bed with 1 thin blanket, basin chipped at the lip, jug half full, 3 pegs on the wall and only 2 garments worth hanging, a cracked trunk that had once travelled with her mother and now served as table, chair and lockbox by turns. She set the candle in a saucer, unpinned her hair with stiff fingers, and crossed to the loose board near the bed leg, where her remaining papers lay wrapped in oilcloth. Captain Ericson's navigation notes, reduced to 1-stitched quire after years of pilfering and damp, a childish copybook with arithmetic exercises in his hand and hers, a letter from her mother written before the second marriage, full of ordinary domestic plans that had never come to pass, and therefore hurt more than any grand declaration could have done. Beneath them, hidden flat, the notice from the trustees acknowledging funds held in abeyance until lawful marriage. Lady Voss had once denied that notice existed. Margaret had found it by chance in discarded correspondence and kept silent, because silence preserved advantages speech would forfeit. She sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, and laid the papers in order by candlelight, her split knuckle leaving a faint rust mark on the margin, until she dabbed it away with the hem of her shift. 1 week. She measured the phrase not in days but in hazards. If she refused Mr. Bream outright, Lady Voss could cast her out and call it moral necessity. A woman dismissed from her guardian's house without reference found doors closed before she knocked. If she accepted, the trust would pass from one hand that controlled to another hand that consumed, and Mr. Bream's reputation for thrift and temper travelled faster than his wagons. If she ran tonight, she had 3 shillings, 1 good chemise, no character, and winter at the threshold. The old training her father had pressed into her returned even through hunger and fear. Set bearings, mark reefs, choose route before gale. Her body ached from the road and from standing still when insult demanded movement, yet the stillness remained deliberate, not empty. She did not cry. Tears had become a luxury too visible to spend. Instead, she took up the copybook and read 1 line aloud under her breath, the way sailors read stars to keep from losing north. Keep your hand steady and your numbers honest. In the passage below, footsteps passed and faded. Laughter rose once from Clara's room, then ceased. Rain worked steadily at the slates. Margaret rewrapped the papers, slid them back beneath the board, and lay down fully clothed, with her bandaged hand on her chest, as if pinning herself to the narrow mattress, so night could not shake her loose. Sleep did not come quickly. Hunger sharpened, dulled, and sharpened again. The house settled around her, timber and stone remembering older storms. Somewhere before midnight she heard Lady Voss's bell ring for hot water, then ring again when it was not immediate, and she closed her eyes in the dark and began, with the calm of long practice, to plan what could be carried if one were forced to leave with nothing. Sleep had just begun to loosen its grip on her when a shout tore through the yard below and jolted her upright so fast the bedrope creaked under her weight. Another shout followed, closer. Then the hard metallic clatter of the service gate thrown open against stone, and with it the sharp, panicked scream of a horse that had run too far and too hard. Margaret was on her feet before the second cry ended, candle snatched from saucer, shawl dragged around her shoulders, one boot half-laced and the other unlaced entirely as she reached the stair. The attic's cold gave way to corridor draught, corridor to back stair darkness, darkness to kitchen heat and steam, where cook stood rigid at the table with a ladle in one hand and fear plain on her face. A stable boy burst through the door, dripping rainwater, chest heaving, eyes wide as saucers. "Riderless!" he gasped. "At the gate! Ashbourne colours on the tack! No rider!" He crossed himself without seeming to know he had done it. Cook swore under her breath and turned on Margaret because Lady Voss's bell had begun to ring again upstairs, and the house still demanded obedience even when alarm pressed at every seam. "You, Yard, move the feed sacks off the lower wall before they soak through, now!" Margaret opened her mouth once to ask about the horse, closed it because questions took time she did not own, and went into the storm with rain striking her face like thrown grit. Wind tore at her mantle and drove water through linen and wool in a single breath. In the yard the gelding circled wild-eyed near the gate, foam at its bit, reins trailing in mud, one stirrup leather snapped clean. A footman and two grooms edged toward it without conviction, each waiting for another to commit first. Margaret shouldered past stacked kindling, bent to seize the first feed sack, and felt the wet burlap drag at her split knuckle until pain flashed white behind her eyes. She carried one sack, then another, then heard it. Not the horse now, but a dull, rolling crash from the lane beyond the wall, wood striking stone, then a child's cry cut short as if swallowed by rain. Every body in the yard froze for half a beat. No order came from above. No master stood there to grant permission. Margaret dropped the third sack where it hit and ran for the gate, boots sliding in churned earth, skirts heavy as netting, breath burning in her throat. She reached the lane as a carriage wheel finished its hopeless turn in the ditch and tipped the carriage broadside against the bank. One door wrenched open, a lantern swinging from its hook and throwing mad arcs of light over mud, harness, and the small, still form near the broken shaft. The child lay on his side, perhaps 7, perhaps 8, curls plastered dark with rain, coat torn at the shoulder, blood running in a thin line from the temple and vanishing into the collar. Margaret dropped to her knees in mud that soaked through to skin at once, and slid her hand behind his head to keep it steady, fingers already slick, pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her gums. "Thomas, cloth!" she shouted over her shoulder, naming the nearest footman without looking to see if it was him. "Now, press here when I move." No one moved. She looked up, rain in her eyes, and saw all 3 men at the gate staring at the child as if rank itself had made him untouchable. "He will bleed while you wait," she said, voice raw. "Give me cloth." A groom finally tore his cravat free with shaking hands and thrust it toward her. She folded it hard, set pressure at the wound, spoke low to the child because sound might tether him where force could not. "Stay! Do you hear me? Stay with me!" Behind the broken carriage, hoofbeats thundered up the lane and stopped so abruptly stones spat from under iron shoes. A second carriage, guards. The world narrowed to rain, blood, and the smell of wet leather. By the time the church clock in the village struck midnight, One slow iron note through storm, the damaged carriage door moved from within. A boot hit the mud. Then a second. The man who stepped down from the tilted carriage seemed to bring his own weather with him. Coat soaked black to the waist, hat gone, dark hair plastered at the temples, jaw cut by a pale scar that ran from ear to chin as if steel had once tried to divide him and failed. He was very tall, broad through the shoulders, even drenched, and every servant in the yard straightened at once with that involuntary motion people made in the presence of power they feared more than they respected. Margaret did not need introduction. Everyone knew the Duke of Ashbourne by sight or rumour, by the way magistrates deferred, by the way lesser men lowered their voices when his name crossed a room. Lord Julian Ashbourne crossed the distance to the child in 3 strides and dropped to one knee opposite her without regard for mud ruining his coat. His eyes were grey in the lantern swing, hard as winter water, and fixed first on the boy, then on Margaret's hands, then on her face. "Report," he said. One word, command shaped like necessity. Margaret kept pressure on the cravat and answered before she considered whether she ought. "Thrown against the shaft when the wheel failed. Temple wound. Breathing shallow but regular. No vomiting yet. He stirred once." The Duke's gaze snapped to the footmen crowding uselessly near the gate. "Lantern! Surgeon! Move!" They moved then, stumbling over one another in haste because his voice admitted no delay. He turned back and saw what no one in Halwick ever named unless to mock. Her trembling from cold, knuckles split under soaked linen, dress more patched than fabric at the hem, rain streaming from hair she had pinned in haste and now falling loose against her throat. "You are shivering," he said. "Your hands are torn. Hold pressure there and do not let him turn." She almost laughed from strain because she had already done all 3, but the laugh died before breath. "Yes, Your Grace." He peeled off his gloves with his teeth, pressed 2 fingers to the child's neck, then to his wrist, then looked at the wheel and the ditch and the snapped leather as if assembling a map no one else could read. A guard approached, bowed quickly. "Your Grace, we can carry Master Peter inside the carriage and—" "No!" The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Not upright, board and blankets. From Halwick now." He looked at Margaret again. "Can you keep him awake?" "If he wakes fully." "Then wake him." She bent close to the child, speaking his name, though she had only just heard it from the guard, describing ordinary things in steady rhythm because panic made breathing shallow and rhythm made it return. A hearth, warm broth, a hound asleep before the fire. The boy flinched once and moaned, "Good!" Pain meant presence. Her hand cramped. She did not ease pressure. Water ran down her sleeve and into the wound dressing, pinking the cloth at the edges. She needed dry linen. She needed light that did not swing. She needed anyone in this yard to act without waiting for rank to bless mercy. A figure swept into the lane under a black umbrella, lavender scent absurdly intact in rain, silk skirts lifted clear of mud by 2 maids. Lady Voss had come to the threshold, but not yet to the ditch, outrage sharper than fear in her face. "What has happened here?" she demanded, then saw Margaret kneeling in filth with blood on her cuffs and drew herself up as if struck. "You stand away from that child at once." Margaret did not move. The Duke rose with measured stillness that made even rain seem to hesitate. "She will not move," he said. Lady Voss blinked, recovered quickly, and curtsied shallowly. Calculation, replacing shock. "Your Grace, forgive the disorder. My servant oversteps from zeal. I shall send proper hands." The Duke's expression did not alter. "She is the only proper hand I see using." The words landed harder than a shout. Margaret felt heat rise under freezing skin, not from pride, from danger. Lady Voss disliked correction in private. In public, it became vengeance stored for later use. The Duke glanced once at Margaret's bandage, now unwrapped and soaked, and held out his own clean handkerchief. "Replace the cloth." She obeyed, lifting pressure only as long as needed, fingers clumsy with cold. His hand came over hers for 1 second to set the angle. Warm, steady. The contact was brief and clinical, yet awareness flashed through her skin like lightning over water, involuntary and unwelcome. He withdrew first. Good. A carriage lantern from the second coach was brought nearer. In the clearer light she saw the scar at his jaw pull tight when he clenched his teeth, saw exhaustion carved under his eyes, saw that his left sleeve was dark, not only with rain. "You are hurt," she said, before caution could silence her. His gaze locked on hers, unreadable. "Not now." He turned to his guard captain. "Send to Ravensholt for Dr. Hale. If roads are blocked, break them?" "Yes, Your Grace. And send a rider to the magistrate regarding attempted interference with my ward's route." Lady Voss stiffened. "Interference?" He did not look at her. "A wheel does not shear clean on level road by accident." The lane went very still, except for rain. Margaret kept her eyes on the child because watching the powerful accuse one another in public invited punishment from both sides. Yet she heard every word. Lady Voss's voice softened to honey over steel. "Surely this is neither place nor hour for suspicion." "Correct," the Duke said. "It is the place for obedience." He crouched again opposite Margaret, lower now, close enough that she could smell wet wool and iron and the faint medicinal sting of spirits. "Listen carefully, Miss—" He paused, waiting. "Eriksson," she said. Something changed in his face at the name. Not recognition exactly, but attention sharpened to a point. "Miss Eriksson, you will ride with the boy to Ashburn Hall. You will keep him conscious. You will report to my housekeeper when you arrive. Do not argue." Lady Voss stepped forward, silk, whispering fury. "She cannot leave this house without my permission." For the first time the Duke turned his full gaze on her. "Then grant it." "I do not grant it." One word again, no shout, no flourish. A fact delivered as command. Lady Voss's mouth thinned to a line so fine it looked bloodless. "Very well, Your Grace. For the night." The concession tasted like poison in the air. Margaret swallowed against a throat gone tight with cold and consequence. To refuse might cost a life. To accept would cost her later in ways already easy to imagine. She tightened the fresh cloth at the child's temple and met the Duke's eyes once, directly, because if she must step into danger, she would do it awake. "I will go," she said, "but if he seizes on the road, I require laudanum measured by drops, not spoon and hot bricks at his feet. He has lost heat." The Duke's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "You issue orders in my lane, Miss Eriksson." "Only where needed, Your Grace." Rain ran from his jaw to his collar. "Good. Keep doing so." He stood and offered his hand to raise her from the mud. She hesitated one breath, then placed her torn fingers in his gloved palm and let him pull her upright beside his ward while the servants watched in stunned silence, and somewhere behind them St. Jude's bell gave another cold stroke into the storm. The bell's stroke had not finished fading when the yard erupted into motion at last. A pantry door was lifted from its hinges and carried to the ditch. Blankets came from Halwick's still-room chest. Then another armful at the Duke's curt command when he saw the first were damp. Margaret knelt again, one knee sunk in mud, and kept steady pressure while they slid the makeshift board beneath the boy. His lashes fluttered. His mouth moved without sound. "Peter," she said, close to his ear, "look at me, follow my voice." His eyes opened a fraction. Grey. Unfocused, he found her chin, then lost it. "That is enough," she told him. "Stay." The Duke took the front of the board. A guard took the rear. They moved in one measured lift toward the second carriage where lantern light held steady and bright. Lady Voss stood beneath her umbrella, jaw rigid, silk untouched by mud, while Margaret's skirts dripped and clung. Margaret did not look at her again. Looking gave power to the wrong person. Inside the carriage she settled on the forward bench and drew the boy across to lie with his head against her lap so his neck would not roll on the rutted road. The Duke leaned in through the open door, rain running from the brim of a hat someone had thrust into his hand too late to matter. He passed her a folded roll of linen, a flask, and a small lacquered case. "Bandages, brandy, sal volatile," he said. "Doctor at the hall." She nodded. "Once. He must not sleep deeply." "I know." He held her gaze 1 second longer, then gave the order to move and stepped back. She expected him to mount and ride ahead. Instead, she felt the carriage shift as he entered from the opposite side and sat across from her, boots planted wide for the jolts, one gloved hand braced against the frame. The wheels struck the first rut and the child moaned. Margaret steadied his head and began to speak in low rhythm. Not soothing words now, but practical anchors. "You are in a carriage. You are warm. You are going home. Breathe with me." She counted each breath against the sway. At the 5th mile marker he tried to turn. Pain creased his brow. She checked him with a gentle hand. The Duke watched without interruption. Lantern light swung over his face and carved it into shadow and pale planes, scar bright against wet skin. At one sharp turn he caught the brass rail with his left hand and hissed once through his teeth before he masked it. Blood had dried at the cuff of that sleeve in a dark half-moon. She looked up despite herself. "Your arm, Your Grace." "Later. Later may be worse." His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in refusal, worn thin by use. "Attend to Peter." She did. The boy's pulse under her fingers ran fast but present. His breathing stayed shallow, then deepened by degrees as road became smoother near the Ashbourne boundary. Rain softened to a hard mist. By the time the great gates opened, her hands had gone numb from holding one position, and her back burned from bracing with each stone and dip. Ashbourne Hall rose from the dark like a cliff of lit windows and black slate, too large to be kind. Yet the front court blazed with lamps, doors open, servants in 2 lines, ready with blankets, braziers, and a wheeled invalid chair that was waved aside the moment the Duke stepped down and said, "Board only. Keep him level." No one argued, no one hesitated. A woman in plain grey bombazine met them at the threshold, hair scraped smooth beneath a cap, eyes quick and unstartled. "Mrs. Davies, Your Grace. Nursery fire. Dr. Hale when he arrives. Miss Erickson has charge until then." Mrs. Davies looked at Margaret's soaked dress, blooded cuffs and split knuckle. Her expression altered by a hair's breadth. Respect, then decision. "This way, miss." They carried Peter up the west stair where runners, muffled boots and portraits watched without pity. In the nursery, coals glowed deep in a broad grate. A copper kettle already hissed over flame. Margaret directed before she remembered she had no rank in this house. "Pillow folded under the left shoulder, not higher. Another lamp, here. Scissors boiled, clean thread if the surgeon asks." A maid stared, then looked to Mrs. Davies. Mrs. Davies gave one sharp nod. The maid moved. The Duke remained in the doorway until Peter was set down and covered. Only then did he strip his gloves and hand them to a footman without looking away from the bed. "Where is Hyle?" Ryder sent, your grace. He was at Casterly Farm. Then fetch him faster. As if summoned by force of command, hoofs sounded in the court below less than 10 minutes later. Dr. Hale entered with rein at his shoulders, spectacles fogged, valise swinging. He went straight to the bed, and Margaret stepped aside, but not far. "Who dressed this?" he asked, fingers at the bandage. "I did," she said. "Good compression." "You may assist." She washed her hands in hot water with vinegar, teeth clenched at the sting in cracked skin, and held lamp and basin, while the surgeon cleaned the temple wound and took 2 neat stitches. Peter whimpered once and caught at Margaret's sleeve with surprising strength. "Stay," he breathed. "I'm here," she said. Hale examined pupils, ribs, wrists. "Concussion, no skull fracture I can detect. Keep him wakeful another hour, then permit shallow sleep. Broth at dawn. If he vomits or fails to rouse, send at once." The Duke's voice came from behind her shoulder. "He will not fail to rouse." Dr. Hale did not answer the challenge. He packed his tools, gave written directions to Mrs. Davies, and finally looked at Margaret's hand. "You require stitching yourself." "She can be seen when Peter rests," the Duke said. Margaret wrapped fresh linen around the knuckle before either man could insist. "It can wait." Hale snorted softly. "Stubborn as sailors, both of you." He bowed to the Duke and left. Servants thinned from the room by quiet degrees. By the time the hall clock struck 1, only Mrs. Davies, one undermaid dozing upright by the wall, and Margaret remained by the bed. The Duke had gone to change, Mrs. Davies said, and to send dispatches. Peter drifted in and out, fever beginning to rise under his skin. "Talk to him," Mrs. Davies murmured. "He follows voices better than physic." Margaret nodded. Her own body had begun to shake now that urgency eased. She clasped her hands between her knees until it passed, then reached into the pocket sewn inside her skirt and touched the folded scrap she always kept there, a copied line from her father's navigation notes, ink faded by years and handling. "Keep your hand steady and your numbers honest." She did not read it. She only felt the crease and let memory do its work. Peter stirred, breath quickening with the dream edge where pain returned. Margaret leaned close and began to recite from Captain Ericson's pages. Not story, but method. Latitude by noon sight. Drift allowance in crosswind. Reef points by moon and cloud. The words were plain. The rhythm mattered more than the meaning. Mrs. Davies watched from the hearth. "That is an odd nursery tale." "It was not a tale," Margaret said. "It was how my father kept men alive." Peter's fingers unclenched against the blanket as she spoke. When his breathing grew uneven again, she shifted from instruction to song, the old sailor's lullaby Captain Ericson had used when storms made timber groan and sleep would not come. Her voice was low and unadorned, roughened by cold. It filled the nursery without asking leave. By the third refrain, the undermaid by the wall had tears on her cheeks she did not wipe. Mrs. Davies turned her face to hide her own expression and pretended to busy herself with kettle and cup. A soft movement at the threshold lifted the skin at the back of Margaret's neck. She did not stop singing. In the glass of the cabinet she saw him reflected, the Duke, changed into dry black coat and plain waistcoat, arm now bandaged beneath the sleeve, standing very still with one hand on the jamb, as if he had walked there and forgotten why. He did not enter. He did not speak. She kept the lullaby steady to the end of the verse, then bent to check Peter's pulse. Regular now, slower. She allowed her own breath to fall with his. Mrs. Davies crossed to the doorway, saw the Duke and made to curtsy. He lifted 2 fingers without looking at her. Silence. She halted and retreated. When Margaret finally looked directly toward the threshold, He had moved half a step inside, no farther. His gaze was on Peter first, then on the folded scrap of paper now visible near Margaret's cuff, where it had slipped from her pocket. "What did you sing?" he asked. "A shipboard lullaby, Your Grace?" "From where?" "From Captain Ericson's notebooks." The name hung between them. Something in his face tightened, then settled into that controlled blankness she had already learned was not emptiness, but restraint. "Your father served Baltic routes," he said. She stiffened. "He did. I read his soundings when I was a boy." The nursery fire shifted and dropped, sending a plume of sparks up the flue. Margaret stared at him, because she did not know what to do with a memory that touched hers without permission. No one at Hallowig spoke of Captain Ericson unless to mention debts and delays. To hear his work named as work, not burden, struck deeper than kindness might have done. Peter gave a small cry and turned his head. Margaret was with him at once, hand to brow, voice low. "Easy. You are safe." The Duke moved then, finally crossing the room in 2 quiet steps. "Miss Ericson, eat." She looked up, uncomprehending. He pointed at the tray Mrs. Davies had set untouched on the side table. Broth, bread, a wedge of cheese. "Now." "I am not hungry." "Liar!" The word was soft, sharp. "You are shaking. Your lips are white. You have had no food since yesterday." Heat rose to her face, despite exhaustion. "Peter wakes. If I rise—" "Then eat where you sit." His jaw set. "That is an order." Mrs. Davies had already brought the tray nearer. Margaret took the spoon because refusal would waste time and draw attention from the bed. The broth was rich and salted. It hurt going down. She swallowed anyway, then broke bread into small pieces and forced herself through half before nausea faded and her hands steadied. The Duke watched until she set the bowl down. Only then did he speak to Mrs. Davies. "Prepare the blue room adjoining the nursery for Miss Ericson. Fire lit, dry clothes. She remains on this floor." Margaret straightened. "Your Grace, I can sleep in a chair." "No, it is unnecessary." "So is frostbite," he said. "You will use the room." The command held no softness, yet she heard the care under it, and disliked the way that knowledge unsettled her more than scorn ever had. Scorn had rules. This did not. By 2 in the morning, Peter slept in brief, shallow stretches, rousing when called, answering his name. Dr. Hale's instructions had been met. Mrs. Davies dismissed the undermaid and sent for a fresh one at dawn. The house quieted into that deep pre-morning hush where every footstep sounds like trespass. Margaret sat beside the bed with Captain Ericson's copied page in her lap and mended the edge where old folds had split. Needle in, needle through, thread drawn taut. Her bandaged knuckle bled once and stained the margin. She sucked in breath, pressed linen to skin, and kept sewing until the paper held. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. The Duke had returned without sound and now stood near enough to see the tiny script on the page. "You carried that in a storm," he said. "I carry it always." He regarded her a long time. The grey of his eyes looked almost colourless in lamp glow. "Why did you not leave Hallwig years ago?" he asked. The question struck too cleanly. She set the needle down with care. "Leave for where?" "Anywhere." She gave one tired breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "A woman without references, money or protection does not go anywhere. She is sent." His hand flexed once at his side bandage, hidden beneath dark cloth. "You are at Ashbourne now. For tonight. For as long as Peter requires. A beat. And longer, if I decide it." There it was, rank laid bare. She should have bowed her head and accepted. She should have thanked him. Instead, she heard her own voice answer with the precision she used only when cornered by what mattered. "I will stay while the child needs me," she said, "not because I am decided." His expression did not change, yet the room seemed to narrow to the distance between them, to the quiet crackle from the grate, to the sleeping boy between command and defiance. "Good," he said at last. "I prefer clear terms." Peter stirred again, saved her from replying, and she bent over him, cooling cloth to brow, counting breaths. When she looked up once more, the Duke had moved to the window where rain silvered the pane. He stood there unmoving through 2 full quarter-hour chimes, as if keeping watch over a border no one else could see, while Margaret held the boy's hand and sang very softly of stars, northing lines, and safe harbours until dawn began, pale and cold, at the edge of Ashbourne's fields. Dawn thinned the darkness by increments, and still he did not move from the window. Margaret kept her hand over Peter's smaller hand and sang the last line of the lullaby twice, softer each time, until his breathing settled into a rhythm that no longer scraped at her nerves. The nursery smelled of banked coal, vinegar from Dr. Hale's instruments, and wet wool drying near the grate. Her own sleeves had stiffened where rainwater and blood had dried together. When she shifted, pain tugged at the split knuckle under fresh linen and ran up her wrist in a hot thread. She ignored it. She had learned to ignore many things. Peter stirred at first light and opened his eyes fully this time. Fear arrived before recognition. His fingers clutched at her cuff. "Where am I?" "At Ashbourne Hall," she said. "You are safe. You struck your head, but the surgeon has seen you." His gaze slid past her toward the broad, dark figure near the window. "Julian!" The Duke crossed the room then, silent on the runner, and came to the bedside without hurry. "I am here." Peter's mouth trembled once. "I dreamed the wheel broke again." "It did," the Duke said. He adjusted the blanket with precise hands. "It will not touch you again." No comfort words, no falsehood, yet the boy's shoulders eased. Margaret reached for the cup Mrs. Davies had left and raised Peter carefully so he could sip. He drank 2 swallows, then turned his face into her sleeve and closed his eyes again. "Not sleep. Rest." She lowered him by degrees and checked his pupils as Dr. Hale had shown her. Equal, responsive. Her own vision blurred at the edges for a moment, a grey narrowing she recognised from long hunger and longer nights. She set both feet hard on the floor until the room steadied. The Duke saw it. "You will sit," he said. "I am sitting, Your Grace." "You will eat again." "I can do so later." His gaze dropped to her untouched left hand, to the tremor she could not fully suppress, then lifted back to her face with that blunt, unsheltered accuracy that made evasion useless. "You have worked through rain, blood loss, and cold for 6 hours. Later is not a sensible answer." The rebuke should have stung. Instead, it warmed some defended place she had kept iron-bound for years. Someone had counted the hours. Someone had measured the cost. Mrs. Davies entered with fresh broth and stopped when she felt the tension in the room. Her eyes went from Margaret's face to the Duke's. "Dr. Hale waits below, Your Grace. He asks whether he should depart for the farm call." The Duke did not look away from Margaret. "He examines Miss Erikson's hand first. Then he may depart." "It is a torn knuckle, not a fracture," Margaret said. "It is a hand I require functional." His tone remained even. "Do not argue for the sake of habit." Mrs. Davies, wise enough not to betray surprise, set the tray down near Margaret's knee and withdrew. The door closed with a soft click. Quiet returned, broken only by Peter's breathing and the small hiss of the fire. Margaret took the spoon because resistance now would become spectacle later. Broth coated her empty stomach like heat poured into frozen glass. She forced herself to continue until the bowl was half gone. The Duke stood beside the bed, one hand resting on the carved rail, eyes on Peter rather than on her, as if giving privacy while enforcing the order. She found herself speaking before caution could intervene. "You have not slept either." He did not turn. "No." "You are still bleeding under that bandage." "No." The lie was clean and pointless. She almost smiled at it, then did not. "Your sleeve says otherwise." He looked at her then, directly, and for one beat the hard exterior she had seen in the lane thinned enough to show strain beneath. "Does defiance sustain you, Miss Erickson, or only inconvenience everyone near you?" "It has sustained me thus far." His mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "I noticed." 3 days later she would remember that word and understand it differently. In that moment she only felt the odd shock of being observed without contempt. A knock sounded. Mrs. Davies returned, this time with a folded note on a salver. Green wax. Lady Voss's seal. Margaret's stomach tightened so sharply she set the spoon down before her hand shook and spilled broth on Peter's blanket. "From Halewick Court," Mrs. Davies said quietly. "Delivered by a groom who asked for immediate reply." The Duke took the note, broke the seal, and read in silence. The nursery seemed to draw inward around that single sheet of paper. Margaret watched his face for change and saw almost none, only the scar along his jaw pulling tighter as his teeth set. He handed the note to the fire without offering it to her. The edge blackened, curled, and vanished. "Mrs. Davies." "Yes, Your Grace. You will send written reply, dictation now." Mrs. Davies stepped to the small writing desk near the wall and lifted a pen. The Duke spoke as if issuing deployment orders. "Lady Voss is to be informed that Miss Margaret Erickson is retained at Ashbourne Hall by my authority as nurse companion to my ward until medical release. She will receive wages from this household, entered in the steward's book beginning this morning. Any attempt to compel her removal will be treated as interference with my household and answered through magistrate." Margaret turned to him fully. "Your Grace, that will make matters worse." "It clarifies matters." "She will punish the servants who carried the message." His expression altered then, colder than before, colder because it was now deliberate. "Name the servants." "I do not know which groom brought the note." He shifted his attention to Mrs. Davies. "Find out. The messenger is to be fed, paid, and sent back with my carriage, not on horseback. If reprisals occur at Halewick, the names come to me." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Davies wrote quickly, sanded the page, folded, sealed, and left. The silence she left behind felt different from the silences at Halewick, not empty, charged. Margaret sat very still with Peter's pulse beneath her fingertips and tried to calculate what this new line in the ledger would cost. "You should not have done that," she said at last. The Duke answered without softening. "I should have done it sooner." She looked up sharply. "Sooner than what?" "Sooner than this morning, sooner than the lane, sooner than allowing Lady Voss to pretend your labour was hers to command without limit." Her breath caught. "You know very little of what occurs in that house." "I know enough." He counted on his fingers as if reading from a report. "You arrived with malnourishment visible under your cheekbones. Your boots leak at both seams. Your right hand shows repeated needle trauma and alkali burns. Old bruising along the left forearm, yellowed, not recent. You eat as if food will be removed at any second. Shall I continue?" Shame burned before she could master it, swift and unwelcome. She turned her face toward the bed so he would not see the heat in her eyes. Do not list me like an inventory. A pause. Then, quieter and far more dangerous for being quieter, you were listed as an inventory long before I spoke. That landed where no apology could have reached. Peter made a small sound and opened his eyes again. Margaret bent at once, grateful for the task. Peter, can you tell me your full name? Peter Vale Ashbourne, he whispered. Good. And where are you? Nursery. And who is this? She glanced toward the Duke. Peter's mouth moved around a tired smile. My guardian. He frowns when worried. A sound escaped Margaret that might have been a laugh in gentler circumstances. She felt the Duke's gaze on her profile and did not meet it. But by the first bell of 7, rain had stopped. Pale sun touched the nursery carpet in a narrow gold strip that made dust visible in the air. Dr. Hale came, examined Peter, and pronounced cautious improvement. He stitched Margaret's knuckle despite her protests, tied the final knot with brisk competence, and warned her against using the hand for at least a day. She thanked him. He gave her a dry look that said he did not expect obedience. When he had gone, Margaret rose too quickly from the chair, and the room tilted again. A hard hand closed around her uninjured elbow, steadying before she could fall against the bed. Enough, the Duke said. She tried to pull back on instinct. His grip loosened instantly, but did not release until she was balanced. No possession in it, only control held in check. I can stand. You can, briefly, that is not the standard. I cannot abandon him. You are not abandoning him. You are changing watch. He turned toward the door and spoke once. Martha! The undermaid appeared almost immediately, apron straight, eyes lowered. You will sit with Master Peter for 20 minutes. If he wakes fully, summon Miss Erikson at once. If he sleeps, you do not wake him. Yes, Your Grace. Margaret stared. You had her waiting outside. I had 3 staff waiting outside, he said, because you were near collapse and likely to refuse relief. Heat rose to her face again, this time anger mixed with a gratitude she did not wish to feel. You planned for my disobedience. I planned for your reliability. They are adjacent. He guided her, without touching now, to the adjoining blue room he had ordered prepared in the night. Fire burned low and clean. A dry gown lay folded on a chair. A basin steamed on a washstand. Morning light showed faded embroidery on the coverlet. Tiny cornflowers worn almost white at the edges. At the threshold she stopped. If I sleep, wake me in 20 minutes. No, Your Grace, you will sleep until your body wakes you. That could be hours. Yes, Peter may worsen. I will sit with him. She searched his face for mockery and found none. Only that same austere certainty he brought to crisis, now turned on her instead of on road and guards. You have estate business, she said. Cancelled. Correspondence. Deferred. You cannot stand watch in a nursery all day. I can stand where I choose. The words should have sounded like rank. They sounded like oath. She felt suddenly, acutely, the distance between all she had endured alone and this new, disorienting fact of shared burden. Her throat tightened. She looked down at her stitched hand to keep her voice steady. Why? He answered after a beat, and when he spoke his tone had lost its edge. Because at Halewick Lane you were ordered away by your own household and stayed for a child not your blood, not your duty, not your safety. Because you kept him breathing while titled men waited for permission to touch him. Because I do not permit courage to be punished when I can prevent it. She had no practised reply for that, none that preserved distance, none that preserved the old map of power she understood. He stepped back from the door, giving her room and route both. Sleep, Miss Erikson, that is a command." She moved to the bed and sat, then lay down still half-dressed because urgency had rewired her body against comfort. He drew the blanket over her with one efficient motion and turned toward the nursery door. "Your Grace," he paused, "if Lady Voss sends again—" "She will. Do not provoke her on my account." He looked over his shoulder. "Your account is precisely the one in question." Then he left. Margaret listened to his steps cross into the nursery, heard the chair scrape once on the floorboards, heard nothing after. No pacing, no muttered orders, no restless movement of a man accustomed to command and incapable of stillness. She told herself she would only close her eyes for a minute. She woke to the clock striking 9 and to the same silence beyond the door, deep and unbroken. When she rose and crossed back, she found Peter asleep, breathing even, one small hand curled around the edge of the blanket. The Duke sat beside the bed exactly as she had left him, forearms on his knees, gaze on the child, body held in that severe quiet that was almost strain and almost devotion. He had not moved enough for the light to shift over him. Mrs. Davies stood near the hearth with a ledger in hand. She looked at Margaret and then at the Duke, awaiting instruction. He spoke without lifting his eyes from Peter. "Enter this plainly," he said. "Miss Margaret Ericsson is under Ashbourne protection while she remains in this house. She is to be obeyed in all matters concerning the boy's care. No summons removes her except by her own word." Margaret's breath stopped for one startled beat. The Duke finally looked at her, and the next words were for her alone. "If you choose to leave, no one will stop you?" Margaret did not answer him at once. The nursery fire settled with a low sigh, and Peter slept between them, small chest rising under the blanket, as if this room were the whole of peace. She looked at the Duke and understood that he had handed her the one thing no one at Halwick had ever offered without price. "Then hear me plainly, Your Grace," she said. "If I go to finish what began before that wheel broke." His eyes held hers. "Good. I am done with half-truths." By the 3rd week of November, Peter could sit up for an hour each morning and demand stories of ships instead of physic. Margaret read to him from memory because Captain Ericsson's full notebooks remained hidden under the loose board in her attic at Halewick, and the separate stitched quire she sometimes used had been left behind in the trunk still withheld there. Each time she paused at a difficult term, Peter corrected her with grave pride as if he had sailed the Baltic himself. The Duke came and went through those hours with the economy of a soldier. Dispatches at dawn, estate accounts at noon, ward at dusk. He did not intrude on her watch. He did not withdraw it either. The magistrate's first report arrived at supper, sealed and blunt. The sheared wheel had not failed by where. The pin had been filed near through. A stable hand from Casterly admitted payment from a broker in Mr. Bream's employ. Under questioning, the broker named Lady Voss's steward. The Duke read the page once, folded it, and set it beside Margaret's plate. "You were right to fear reprisals," he said. She did not touch her food. "Will they charge her?" "They will ask for more than one witness and more than one paper. They always do when silk is involved." 3 days passed before Hallowick sent Margaret's trunk, and when it came, it was lighter than memory. Her 2 better gowns were gone. Her mother's letter was gone. The oilcloth packet beneath the false bottom had been slit and re-sewn with poor thread by a hand that did not expect scrutiny. Margaret opened it on the nursery table while Peter slept and felt her blood turn cold. Captain Ericsson's stitched quire, the partial fair copy she had kept separate from the hidden originals in the attic, remained. The trustee's notice remained. Added beneath them lay 3 folded ledgers she had never seen, each page marked with Lord Voss's old account stamp, each sum written in the same modern ink. Debts assigned to her name that had never existed. Receipts for payments to Mr. Bream. A draft contract transferring interim control of her trust upon betrothal rather than marriage. At the back, one letter in Lady Voss's hand to Ashbourne's former solicitor, proposing cooperation over Peter's guardianship in exchange for silence regarding the Wheel inquiry. Margaret sat very still while the pages trembled once in her fingers. She understood the trap in a single hard line. Bind her to Bream, seize her trust, then hold the Duke's ward scandal over his household while money bled both houses dry. She rewrapped the papers, rose, and went directly to the Duke's study. He was not there. A fire burned low. Rain tapped the glass. On the blotter lay a special licence form, partly completed, his full name already entered in the groom's space, the bride's line blank. She stared at it, heat rising to her face for reasons she refused to name, then folded the forged ledgers over it and sealed both bundles separately with wax from the desk. Mrs. Davies found her in the corridor with cloak and valise in hand. "You are leaving," the housekeeper said. "Not a question. I am going to the magistrate. At this hour. At this hour, Lady Voss cannot buy tomorrow first." Mrs. Davies looked at the valise, then at Margaret's face, and something like sorrow moved through her composed features. She pressed a key into Margaret's palm. "Postern gate. It does not creak if lifted first." A beat. "His Grace gave order the first night. If Miss Erickson leaves, no one stops her." When Margaret stepped onto the back stairs at midnight, every servant along the passage saw her pass. Footman by the silver pantry, a scullery maid with flour on her cuff, Thomas from Halwick, now in Ashbourne livery, eyes red with unslept hours. No one spoke, no one reached for her sleeve. They stood aside with the grave, painful courtesy reserved for a person walking toward danger by choice. Rain had begun again by the time she reached town. She placed the sealed bundle into Magistrate Ellery's night-box, then struck the iron knocker until a clerk appeared with candle and temper both thin. She gave her name, her statement, and the second seal marked with Ashbourne's crest. "Wake him," she said, "now, or record that you refused." The clerk blanched at the crest and disappeared. Within minutes, boots sounded in the passage, then another set behind them. The Duke entered without hat, greatcoat thrown over evening clothes, water running from his hair. He looked at the bundle in Ellery's hands, then at Margaret's face. "You left without escort. I left with evidence. Why? So you could choose what to do without owing me rescue." His jaw tightened. The magistrate cleared his throat and broke the first seal while they stood in cold lamplight and listened to pages being turned like a sentence pronounced. Ellery's expression hardened by degree. "These are forgeries," he said, "and coercive intent is plain." Lady Voss arrived under guard at dawn, silk damp at the hem, fury making her younger and uglier at once. Mr. Bream followed, pale and sweating into his cravat. The hearing chamber filled by the 7 o'clock bell. Clerks, 2 neighbouring land agents, Ashbourne staff, Halwick staff, summoned for witness. Peter's nurse remained at the hall. Peter himself slept, by the Duke's order, under Dr. Hale's watch. Lady Voss did not curtsy to Margaret. "You vindictive little fraud," she said, across the room. "You stole household papers." "I recovered my father's accounts from my own trunk," Margaret answered. "You placed your lies among them." "Lies!" Lady Voss took one fast step and lifted her hand. "Stop!" The word came from the Duke, and the room obeyed it, as if stone had spoken. He moved between them, not touching either woman, his back to Lady Voss, his eyes on Margaret alone. "Charge Lady Voss with fraud and coercion," he said to Ellery, add attempted interference in the transport of my ward. Gossip hissed at the room's edges like steam escaping a locked valve. Someone whispered that Margaret had trapped a duke. Someone else said worse. The Duke turned his head enough for all to hear, and gave them the line that cut clean through every murmur. "Good. I married her this morning." Silence fell so hard even the rain outside seemed distant. Ellery stared. Mrs. Davies closed her eyes briefly, as if she had expected no less. Margaret looked at the Duke in raw astonishment. He set a folded certificate on the magistrate's table. Special licence. Signed at dawn in St. Jude's side chapel by Ellery's own deputy and 2 witnesses pulled from Ashbourne's night staff while the town still slept. Margaret's signature stood beside his, firm, though her hand had shaken once, on the final letter. Ellery read, exhaled and nodded. Then the trust reverts immediately to her Grace, and Lady Voss holds no standing over person or property. Lady Voss's face emptied. Mr. Bream sat down without grace and put his head in his hands. In the doorway, with guards waiting for instruction, Margaret finally answered the question he had flung after her in the night. "I left so you could choose me free of debt," she said. For the first time since she had known him, the Duke had no ready command. His throat worked once. He did not speak. He only took her hand, the stitched one, and held it with care that looked almost like reverence. That afternoon, sentence was entered in full hearing. Lady Voss was convicted of fraud, coercive contracting, and attempted interference with guardianship proceedings. She was removed from all control of Hallowicke and from any authority over Margaret's trust. Mr. Bream was fined, censured, and barred from holding local wards. The broker and steward were remanded for separate trial. The magistrate ordered restitution from seized accounts, and Ellery himself witnessed transfer of keys and ledgers to Margaret's solicitor. By the first week of December, Peter walked the south gallery with only a slight caution on stairs. He insisted Margaret hear him recite longitude rules, and fell asleep halfway through from the effort. "Doctor," Hale declared him out of danger and pretended not to wipe his spectacles twice before leaving. On the same day, the Duke assembled every indoor servant in Ashbourne's hall. Margaret stood beside Mrs. Davies while he read the new household terms in his clipped, unornamented voice. Wages entered weekly, references available by right, no corporal discipline by any rank, dismissal only by written cause. Thomas looked as if he might weep. The scullery maid lifted her chin for the first time Margaret had seen. 2 days later, a printer from York brought galley proofs tied in blue paper. Captain Ericsson's navigation notebooks, collated from Margaret's surviving choir and Admiralty copies Ashbourne had paid to retrieve, were set in clean type, under one line on the title page, edited and annotated by Margaret Ericsson, Duchess of Ashbourne. She touched the ink while it was still faintly tacky, and had to turn away before anyone saw her eyes burn. Sun broke through cloud on the morning she returned to Ashbourne by the front drive. Not hidden at the postern, not sent by backstair. The great doors stood open. Footmen in full livery lined the entry. Mrs. Davies waited at the top step with Peter at her side, solemn in a new coat, one hand tucked into hers. The butler's voice carried through marble and oak and all the rooms that had once denied her. Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashbourne. Margaret crossed the threshold in daylight, and no one in the house looked past her again.